Hey everybody, Nathan Brown here with FCP Euro, and today I'm here to talk through the suspension, brake, and body components on the Volkswagen Atlas and Volkswagen Atlas Cross Sport. This is going to touch on all the major maintenance considerations for these vehicles from 2018 to 2024 plus, and go over some of the common problems or things you might expect to find if you own one of these vehicles or are looking to purchase one and service it yourself. So the Volkswagen Atlas was introduced in 2018, and it's built upon the Volkswagen MQB platform. MQB stands for Modular Transverse Matrix. It actually means something else in German, but I'm not going to bother to try to pronounce it. But essentially it means that there's shared components that are used on the Volkswagen Atlas that are used across a very large number of other Volkswagen vehicles. That actually includes the majority of passenger vehicles, such as the Volkswagen Golf, Jetta Sportwagon, things like that, as well as the Tiguan and the Taos. Now obviously the Tiguan and the Taos are SUVs or compact SUVs, whereas the Atlas is a mid-size SUV, and it's quite large when you start to think about it, especially if it's built on the same basic platform. And what's important to consider is that it's not the same identical thing. So while you do have some components that are shared, so there's certain brake or suspension mounting points, things like that, the actual components that are going on the vehicle are specifically designed for the Atlas. So a lot of what I have on the table here is not going to cross over to a Volkswagen Golf or a GTI or something like that. So the Volkswagen Atlas and Cross Sport, being MQB based, both utilize a McPherson Strut front suspension design and a multi-link rear suspension design. This is very commonly used across pretty much every Volkswagen vehicle that's sold in America these days and has been sold for some time. And it's a very simple, very proven setup that really works well whether you're talking about a passenger car or a big truck like the Atlas. In terms of the front suspension, we'll start with this. As you can see, I have a ball joint, big beefy control arm, separate control arm bracket, rear toe control arm, and some of the used struts off of our Project Atlas here. And as you can see, these are significantly beefier and stronger and of a totally different design than anything else on the MQB platform. So if you're kind of looking into these cars and thinking about, well, how can this thing be a 5,000 pound truck that can tow 5,000 pounds and it's basically based on a Golf? One, that's not that uncommon these days, and two, they really have designed everything to kind of work with that vehicle as a system. There's not really any issue or major common complaints or problems with any of these components early on in the vehicle's life. As you start to gain mileage, as you start to put mileage on the car, especially if you use it sort of more off-road or in heavier use things, if you do quite a lot of towing, these components are going to get more stress, wear and tear, and you're going to start to see some of those results on the road. The most common thing there is going to be on this control arm bushing, which is what we call a popsicle design. This is actually very similar to the older PQ35 suspension and very different than anything else used for MQB. But essentially the control arm fits into this bushing here and it sort of twists as the suspension articulates and moves up and down. Now if you have your Atlas lifted or anything like that, that puts additional strain and wear and tear on these bushings, and they'll begin to tear a little bit more quickly. Very, very easy to get a quick visual inspection of this while the vehicle is actually sitting on the ground, provided it won't roll anywhere. You can see these bushings and see that they'll be articulated. You'll be able to see any kind of tears like that in the suspension bushing. So if they are worn and if they start to tear or give you some additional play, you'll typically start to notice some vibration on the road, especially at highway speeds, and you may start to notice some uneven tire wear, things like that. Now you can purchase and just replace the rear bracket. This is probably going to be by far the most common bushing to need to replace on any of the Atlases as far as a suspension bushing. So you can get this complete unit here, or you can get a complete control arm with that rear bracket attached. I would typically recommend, depending on how handy you are or how involved you want to be with replacing this bushing, either purchasing just the bushing or the complete unit. And the reason for that is that the rear popsicle here can be a little bit difficult to get on and off. At the very, very least, you're going to need a hammer and a brass punch or something like that to try to remove this bushing from the control arm, and you're definitely going to need a pretty sizable dead blow and probably some silicone lubricant or something on those lines to try to get it back on. If you purchase it complete, it comes complete, and you really just have to replace it as a complete unit versus just the rear bracket. Now the difference there, obviously, you'll have to swap over your ball joint, but if you're at a point where you need to replace this bracket, replacing this ball joint is probably going to be a pretty good idea. Again, there's not really a set service interval for those. You're going to basically need to base it on mileage and how the vehicle is performing, and how it's used is really going to impact the life of it. But again, at the very least, I would probably expect somewhere around 100,000 miles or just a little bit less in terms of when that ball joint and this control arm bushing are going to need to be replaced. Now, last thing on this is if you do replace this entire unit, you do get a new front bushing here, obviously, that comes pre-installed on that control arm, but that one does very, very little in terms of support, etc. It generally doesn't really wear out, so you don't really need to worry about that bushing specifically. It really just comes down to what you want to do on the car and how involved you want to get with replacement. So while we're staying on the front suspension, what we have here is the front upper strut mount and the strut bearing. These mount at the top of this strut, and they go through quite a rough life, let's say, on a vehicle that's the size and the weight of the Atlas. And these are carried over from all the other MQB vehicles. So in terms of earlier failures, in terms of earlier problems, these are probably going to be one of the more common ones, especially this mount here, where you're going to start to see some wear, tear, and things like that. Now, it's a metal cup inside of this rubber bushing, and essentially what will happen is that rubber will just compress and begin to develop a little bit of play. You may have some uneven ride height, side to side, depending upon what's going on. Again, when this starts to wear, it's generally not going to make a ton of noise or anything like that. You may start to notice some popping or some clunks and things like that, depending on how the suspension is articulated or you're turning like in a parking lot or a transition. So if you are starting to hear that, it may be an indication that the strut mount and bearing may need to be replaced. Going with the struts themselves, it's a very beefy unit. There's not a ton out there in terms of aftermarket support for the Atlas. Essentially, you have to go with either a genuine shock and strut or a Bilstein V4. We went with the Bilstein V4s on our Project Atlas, and it's a very similar design, a little more cost-effective, than the genuine part from Volkswagen. Typically, these are going to last for a solid 100,000 miles or so. Most of the lift kits out there, like the B2B fabrication units, reutilize this factory strut and spring combo and really just put the spacer in at the top here on the strut mount. So you're not really putting any additional stress on these components compared to factory, which helps to continue to make sure you have a good long life out of the components, even though you're kind of putting it through a bit more. It's really the bushings that take a beating if the car is raised or lowered. Moving on to the rear of the Atlas, again, I mentioned that it has a multi-link rear suspension. So there's a few different components in there. You have a primary rear trailing arm, you have an upper camber arm, a front tow arm that's fixed, and then you have this rear primary control arm and tow arm. Now this cup right here, this bucket, is where the spring sits for the rear suspension. And this bushing right here is the one that sort of goes through the most stress and strain at the rear. They're all moving around quite a bit, but this is the one you primarily need to watch out for, somewhat from a wear and tear standpoint in terms of the actual bushing. So you want to give a good visual inspection again while the vehicle is on the ground to see how much deflection, to see if you have any cracking or dry rotting or tearing there. The main thing I want to point out on the rear, however, is actually this concentric bolt and washer combination. Now this is used on the rear of the car to adjust the toe in and out on the rear alignment. Now, if the vehicle is used in an area where you get a lot of salt, you get a lot of treatments on the roads, things like that, where it gets a lot of rain or condensation or moisture, this bolt can actually seize inside of this bushing, and it can become difficult to adjust the rear alignment of the car. And many times when you need to replace this control arm, it may not necessarily be because the bushing is bad or the control arm has any defect. It's solid steel, it's pretty robust. It's because the alignment can no longer be done correctly because this bolt is seized in there. So if you do live in one of those climates, you may want to potentially take that out and service it, maybe coat it with some anti-seize or something like that, or have your shop do it if you take it to a place for service. That's just kind of preventative maintenance. You will need an alignment after that's done, but it's something that's kind of easy to do. And if the vehicle is lower mileage and it currently works the way it should, that can keep it working that way, and you don't have to replace this control arm prematurely. Lastly, we have at the rear the shock absorber setup. Big, long unit. This is very different from what comes in the car normally. This is the rear top mount, which, similar to the front strut mount, undergoes a lot more wear and tear than the standard MQB component, just because of the weight of the vehicle. And this one is specific to the Atlas. Now, if you look inside here, they have this little sort of foam rubber insert in here to help sort of cushion or dampen some of the noise and vibration that would come through from the road. So on these vehicles, as the mileage starts to go up, that's going to start to compress. And if it starts to compress too much, or to the extent you're getting some metal-to-metal contact, you'll definitely start to hear some rattling and some clunks and things at the top rear of the suspension. Now again, not super common. It's certainly not going to happen at any normal mileage for most users, but it is something to be aware of. And again, if you're going through the vehicle, you're doing a service on the vehicle, if you're replacing your shocks and struts, you want to replace all of the mounts and bearings all at the same time so it's fresh, you get the car aligned, and you're good for another 80,000, 100,000 miles or something like that. So up next, I'm going to talk about the braking system of the Volkswagen Atlas and Atlas Cross Sport. And it's the same system across all those models, regardless of the year, trim level, etc. And what we have is a 335 front disc with a sliding 2-piston caliper, and then a 310 millimeter rear disc with a single piston sliding caliper. The front brake system is specific to the Atlas, so it doesn't really cross to any other models on Volkswagen. So your options on pads, rotors, etc., it's going to be a little bit more different than some of the other Volkswagen models if you're familiar with, all the brands and all the things that you can purchase for some of the more common global Volkswagen vehicles. The rear disc, however, is essentially reused from a huge number of Volkswagen and Audi vehicles. This is a 310 millimeter ventilated rear disc, and this is used on the Golf R. It's used on pretty much any of the 4Motion passenger vehicles, and that would go for the pad as well. The braking system on the Atlas is pretty beefy. It's robust. Obviously, it's got to stop a 5,000 pound vehicle full of 7 people and possibly towing as much as 5,000 pounds. So it needs to work very well. Volkswagen has what I would consider to be probably a fairly aggressive specification brake pad on it in order to do the job that it needs to do. And it does it well. The problem is that you will hear a lot of complaints online, or you may have a complaint yourself, of noisy squealing brakes. Now, squealing brakes is not necessarily an indication that there's a problem, but it can be a little bit annoying, especially if you're in stop-and-go traffic, driving around town, and your car sounds a little less than perfect. So what we typically recommend is a high-quality ceramic brake pad. The Accabono setup is available front and rear for the Atlas. It's a very good, very robust ceramic pad, and that's going to give you the stopping power that you need without the noise or anything like that. The other really big benefit of a ceramic pad is going to be that it is much lower dust than any traditional organic or semi-metallic pad, and it's also going to be easier to clean that dust off your wheels when the time comes to give it a wash. Outside of that, there's not a ton of actual service that's going to be necessary on the braking system of the Volkswagen Atlas. You need to do regular brake bleeds or brake fluid flushes in order to keep the system sort of happy and working correctly. Volkswagen recommends that the first brake bleed occur 3 years after vehicle purchase, and every subsequent brake bleed occur 2 years after that. We generally recommend every 2 years to do a full flush, and that's usually going to be more than enough. If you're using a high quality brake fluid, something from Motul or somebody like that, that's going to last for that 2 years. You're not going to have any problems with moisture penetration or loss of performance or anything like that. And that's pretty much it when it comes to the brakes. Other than that, you want to keep everything clean, you want to keep the rear sliders lubricated, and essentially just kind of go from there. One last thing I do want to mention, because of the weight of the vehicle and some of the ways that they're often going to be used in terms of commuting and things like that, is warped brake rotors or brake pedal vibration. Now, if you have a heavy vehicle that's going to heat up the brake rotors very quickly, it will sometimes heat them up in an uneven fashion. And what will happen is you'll essentially get a high spot or deposits on the rotor that many people would call a warped rotor. The rotor itself is not warped. It just means that there's a pad deposit on the brake disc surface that's a little thicker in one area than another, and that kind of kicks back through the brake pedal. It'll either occur as a shimmy in the wheel under braking, or you'll feel it in the pedal. So that's obviously less than desirable and can be pretty disconcerting, especially in a heavy braking situation on the highway. So when you are going to replace the pads and rotors on your Atlas, I absolutely recommend using the very highest quality disc. That's going to be the primary component when it comes to that. The pad does interplay with it a little bit. Something like this front brake disc here from Ate, or this Zimmermann rear, something that has a very high carbon content, it's going to be a more stable brake rotor, and it's going to last longer and avoid some of those more common problems when you're talking about braking on the Volkswagen Atlas and the Atlas Cross Sport. One of the cooler things about the Volkswagen Atlas and the Atlas Cross Sport is that because it's a modular system that crosses over to other Volkswagens and things like that, you can modify them kind of to your liking. So there are coilover suspension systems or lowering springs available, so you can lower the vehicle, put bigger wheels, smaller tires, and make it a little bit more sporty, a little bit more sort of on-road focused. Likewise, you can put a lift kit on it from a company like B2B Fabrication, which again, as I mentioned, it reuses a lot of the factory components and gives you a couple extra inches of ground clearance over the 8 inches that the factory gives you. You can put bigger wheels and tires, roof rack, kind of do an overlanding theme like the vehicle that's behind me, and really sort of customize it to your own liking. So it's a very versatile vehicle, and with all of these options in the market, it's one of the things that makes it desirable from a modification or a customization standpoint. So with that, let's get this Atlas behind me in there. We'll take a look underneath. It has 110,000 miles on it. About 50,000 of that has been with the lifted suspension. So you'll be able to take a look at some of the wear and tear that you're going to expect on one of these vehicles if you've got it modified or looking at a higher mileage example, or what you may come to expect on yours as the miles start to pile on. So before we go all the way up, I'm actually going to do a little bit of diag on this Atlas here. This belongs to Michael Callahan, who's our head of brand here at FCP Euro, and he's been experiencing some increased wear, or faster wear, on the front tires here. So kind of taking a look at it, trying to see if there's any additional play anywhere in the suspension. Everything feels pretty tight. Checking to see if there's like maybe a bad wheel bearing. He doesn't think that there is. I'm not feeling anything through the spring that would indicate that the bearing on this side is certainly giving a problem. And the wear is noticeable on both sides of the vehicle. So chances are we're going to find something underneath, probably related to the control arm bushings, but I'm not totally sure. We'll find out. One of the things you can notice is there is some extremely severe cupping here on the tire. So essentially, the way that this surface is worn is very uneven, and you basically have these high points. So it can also point to other problems. It could even be a balance issue, or it could be a strut issue where if the strut is worn and you're getting excessive bouncing down the road, and then you get this cupping. So there's a few areas it could be. The car has about 110,000 miles on it. As you can see, it's extremely well used. It gets put through its paces all the time, and is a pretty good example of a well-used, well-loved Volkswagen Atlas. So we'll go ahead, we'll get these wheels and tires off the car, put it the rest of the way up, and then take a look at what we've got. So on these front struts here, one of the telltale signs of a bad strut, or a strut that's on its way out, is going to be a buildup of fluid or leaking of the fluid that's inside of the shock absorber from this area right here, from the piston. Now, while I can see some high polish, where obviously this shock has some wear on it, there's no real clear indication that it's losing fluid or gas or any sort of like compression or any kind of rebound control. So more than likely there might be some other stuff going on with this vehicle more than the shock. Hard to say without testing it, but that's my $2 diagnosis in terms of just a quick visual inspection. So yeah, looking back at these control arm bushings, just looking at it right here without putting any pressure on it, you can see a lot of stress cracks and wear on the bushing itself that I mentioned. So as that thing twists, that's just going to fail. And once it fails and starts to loosen up, and you can see a really heavy tear on the right-hand side there. Once that tears and loosens up, that's going to allow the wheel and the suspension arm to sort of, this popsicle will move back and forth this way, and the whole tire is going to be changing toes. So it's going to make for a very unpleasant experience when it comes to driving the car, and that's where you're going to start to see that uneven tire wear and things like that. So we'll get a pry bar in there to kind of show how much play we have, but that seems like a pretty obvious one to me. Yeah, I mean, you're just seeing all that rubber. I'm not really putting very much pressure on this at all. So you can imagine with the weight of a 5,000 pound vehicle on this, there's a lot of deflection going on. You can kind of open up that crack, but it's mainly going to be more evident while the suspension is loaded and that is twisted. So that's why I kind of mentioned earlier in the video, it's a good idea to check these while the car is on the ground if you can. You probably need ramps if the car is not raised like this. Even if it is raised, you are going to need to take the belly pan off in order to visually gain access to this. So I'm just kind of doing a visual inspection, not really seeing any torn boots or anything like that on the ball joints, so they're actually in pretty good shape. They're I'm sure once we got everything apart, there'd be a decent, not play, but they'd probably be a little bit loose just because of the mileage. But knowing that we need to do those rear control arm brackets, probably just do ball joints, refresh the whole thing all at once, as I mentioned. So the only other primary wear component here on the front suspension are going to be these sway bar end links. Now these don't have a ton of articulation on them, likely due to the suspension design of this particular Atlas compared to some of the other ones. But these ball joints can wear and start to develop play, and usually if you have a lighter tone clunk or a higher tone clunk, very well could be these sway bar end links. Now typically you're going to see some tears on the boots and things like that, and if you were to try to manipulate this, maybe undo it, it'd be very easy to see if that ball joint was bad on that sway bar end link. Thankfully those are really easy to replace and fairly inexpensive. It's something that will wear out, it will need to be replaced, but again, it's not an early failure point. It's really as the miles start to pile up and as you get closer to that 80, 100,000 mile mark. So here on the front brake system of the Atlas, we just have our caliper right here, and then brake disc. As I mentioned, this is a twin piston caliper, so it's a little bit beefier, a little bit bigger than what you'll usually find on one of these vehicles. Now this particular car has genuine brakes on it, front and rear. They were fairly recently done. And it's interesting to note that although they only have about 25 or 30,000 miles on it, we're seeing a decent amount of wear. You've got a decent lip on the disc and a good amount of wear on that pad. So as I mentioned, the heavier vehicle, you're going to be using the brakes more, and replacing the brakes more often is probably going to be just a side effect of owning and driving one of these vehicles, especially if you use it the way that Mike uses his. Just kind of looking at it though, it's a pretty clean setup. You're not seeing really any high spots or hot spots or anything like that. So looking at the pad material here, you can see the thickness of the backing plate and then the thickness of the actual friction material. Now, if you don't have the appropriate tool to measure the depth or the thickness of that pad material, which is typically 5 millimeters of pad materials when you'd want to replace it, usually a good rule is when the pad material starts to equal the backing plate thickness, it's going to be a good idea to either replace or start to think about replacing those brake pads maybe on your next service. But the pads are getting fairly close to needing to be replaced. They're not bad, but something to probably be done in the next 5 or 10,000 miles. Outside of that, whenever you're servicing the brakes on these vehicles, you see it has these slide pins here. You want to make sure that those get lubricated so everything moves correctly, and you're not getting any sort of pivoting of the caliper in the slider or anything like that. But pretty straightforward stuff, very easy to gain access to anything here, just like on the transmission and engine areas that we discussed in the other video. Because of the size of the vehicle, there's a decent amount of room here where you may not have that on a more compact car. So outside of that, you always want to make sure that you have your set screw properly sort of anti-seized and everything like that, so it doesn't get stuck when you do your brake job, so that the next time you go to do it, you have to drill this out. We include that in pretty much all of our brake kits as well. So pretty much anything we have on the FCP Euro website is going to give you everything you need to do the brake service, including lubricating those sliders and everything else. The only other thing that you could maybe consider is that you have this really big long brake line here, and as the vehicle's age, you're going to want to keep an eye on that just to make sure it doesn't dry rot. If you take the vehicle off-road or anything like that, or you're using it in a way where there's a lot of dirt and debris kind of coming through here, a quick visual inspection is always going to be a good idea to make sure you don't have some damage from external forces that you don't catch and then have some kind of a failure. But other than that, it's a pretty service-free system. There's really not too much to talk about. We can take a look at the rear, kind of go over some of the same things, but it's pretty much the same story. So here at the rear of the car, we've got a look at our brake, we have a look at our suspension. Rear caliper here, this is pretty much the same caliper, as I mentioned, that's used on a lot of other Volkswagen and Audi vehicles. Pretty simple setup, sliders. It does have an electronic actuator that can occasionally fail. Typically on these vehicles, especially the more modern ones, many times this will engage automatically, depending on the car, like when you put it in park, things like that. And lack of use is one of the reasons that a lot of the old ones would fail. So modern day, they're not as common, but they do occasionally still fail for sure. Taking a look at the pads and rotors, they're still in good shape. As as I mentioned, these only have about 25,000 miles on it or so, but pretty straightforward stuff. Really nothing to be really all that concerned about. All your normal considerations when it comes to anti-seize or lubricating things appropriately for the caliper, sliders, etc. But pretty basic, honestly. It's very straightforward, very easy to work on. The only real note that I would have on the rear is going to be that with that electronic parking brake actuator, just like any of the other major services on a modern vehicle, you're going to need a diagnostic tool here. Essentially what you'll do is use the diagnostic tool like a VAGCOM or something like that to electronically retract the piston and the caliper, and that will allow you to do the brake service on the car. And of course we have more on that on the DIY that we did on our project car. And as I mentioned, multi-link trailing arm design. So you have this is the primary tow arm where the spring sits, and this is kind of what most people would call the rear lower control arm. We have these front trailing arms here that go into the body of the car, and then the spindle, which has your upper camber arm, and then the front toe link there. The front toe link is just a fixed position unit with a couple of bushings. The camber arm is adjustable at the top here, and you have again bushings inside outside, and this rear trailing arm has a singular very, very large bushing that goes up into the body cup there. Now those bushings are really robust, and you generally don't start to see those start to need to be replaced until you're well over 100,000 miles. Even on this one, I was just in there prying. I couldn't really get any movement on it whatsoever. And because of the design and because of all the load points, they seem to last quite a lot longer. All these components and bushings seem to last quite a lot longer, probably double the life of what you have on the front. Now, as I mentioned, this rear arm is one that gets a lot of load, and it gets a lot of load here on this particular bushing. So I was trying to get a little bit of pressure on it to see if there's any obvious tears in the bushing like we were seeing on the front. And I'm really not seeing anything at all that's out of the ordinary. So even with the mileage on the car and the use that Mike has put this through, I'm not really expecting to need to replace this control arm or bushing just based on that bushing. Now, as I mentioned though, we have our adjustment bolt here with the eccentric washer, and that sits into this cup on the rear subframe. So essentially, if you have this bolt fused to the sleeve inside that bushing, when you go to adjust the alignment on the rear of the car, rather than adjusting the arm, all it does is twist the bushing more. And that's where a lot of damage can actually occur, is if people are trying to heat up that bolt to get adjustment in it, or physically tearing the bushing by rotating it when it's not supposed to rotate. One thing that is of note is this is a very nice kind of beefy canyon crevice channel. It is a really substantial channel that the eccentric washer sits in on both sides of the subframe. So unlike some of the older designs on these Volkswagens where it's just a little welded tab on either side, I wouldn't expect really any problems there. Other than that, looking at this vehicle, looking at corrosion, knowing this is a Northeast vehicle that sees a lot of time in the salt, goes to the mountains constantly for snowboarding, things like that, there's virtually almost zero corrosion on here given the age and the mileage of the vehicle. Some of the older Volkswagens, it would not be unusual to see a decent amount of corrosion on this lower subframe. So it's actually really encouraging, thinking about long-term life of this vehicle, the primary body, all the suspension components, like this is designed and built to last for quite a long time. So talking about, you know, long-term use and viability of the car, it's actually really, really impressive to see one that has this many miles and gets used the way this does without a lot of really obvious rust or anything. So really just kind of, you know, basic checks on the back, making sure everything's good, make sure everything stays in adjustment, and you're kind of good to go. The only other thing, kind of like on the front, is we do have these sway bar end links here. However, unlike the front, it's very, very short run. It does not necessarily go through all those same loads or have the same sort of articulation as the front does. These are still going to go bad eventually, and will still need to be replaced and will make noise when that time comes, but it is a little less likely on the rear than on the front, just like every other component. So one last thing to talk about while we have the car in the air is the panoramic sunroof drains. And they drain in this general sort of front wheel well area on the front of the vehicle, and a similar area that I can point out in the rear of the vehicle. It is a little bit more of an in-depth DIY to clean these out. We do have that on the way, we have that coming out, but that is one of the things you have to kind of take into consideration when it comes to general maintenance on the body of an Atlas. We typically recommend cleaning the sunroof drains about once a year. Once you kind of get the hang of it, it's not too bad, but that is something that you're going to definitely want to address if you have an Atlas or you're thinking about buying one, in terms of making sure that everything functions the way that it should. So at the rear of the car, the sunroof drain is right here behind this panel. So it's basically a process of pulling that off, and there's a cap underneath of there that sort of builds up a lot of dirt behind it, and then obviously it'll back up, and then it'll begin to leak water inside of the vehicle rather than allowing that water to drain out of the back. So it's super, super common on these and fairly straightforward, but again, a little bit more in depth, but we'll show you how to do that on a future DIY. So one of the other complaints that we hear about the Volkswagen Atlas is wind noise, and specifically wind noise at the driver's door. Now, there's not anything intrinsically wrong with the design per se. I mean, it is a boxy vehicle. You are going to get more wind noise maybe overall than a sleeker sedan or something like that. But one of the things that can happen is the alignment of this driver's door can be adjusted, and that can help to reduce it. And I'll show you exactly how and why. So inside the vehicle here, obviously you have your internal door seal here, and you have an external door seal here that runs along the perimeter of the door. Now this seal on the door is glued to the frame of the door. So it's not super easy to replace, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend diving into this unless you absolutely are sure this needs to be replaced. Sometimes this glue can degrade and it'll start to come away. You can get either some noise there or a little bit of a water leak, but that's not really something that we're seeing a lot of on these vehicles yet. But over time, as this rubber begins to get a little bit harder as the vehicle is worn, this will begin to crush down. And what you'll have is a little bit basically of extra room in here to where this rubber seal is not sealing the way that it should against the door itself. So short of replacing this seal completely, you can simply take an M8 triple square socket, something like this, and adjust the striker. It's very, very simple. You just need to loosen it enough to get this slid in, and then close the door gently to make sure the alignment is still good and that you're not getting any sort of like thumps or clunks or anything as it goes together. You want it to open and close the same as it would from the factory. And it's very, very easy to make some very small adjustments and essentially move this striker in slightly so it holds the door tighter against this seal and then can reduce that noise potentially. If you're seeing that this seal has a good deal of wear, this one actually does have a good deal of wear. You can replace this entire seal a little bit more easily. There's a pinch weld essentially. There's a frame here on the vehicle that basically locks into and slides around. It does take a little bit of time, but it's not too difficult to do. And then once you close it, it'll seal tight. And you can notice that on some vehicles, because there is that adjustment there may be a difference in panel gap. So if you're seeing a lot of wind noise or hearing a lot of wind noise, you might want to check this adjustment before you dive into anything too crazy. And you can see that this door is ever so slightly raised out from this back body line on the rear door. So that could use that adjustment on that striker to pull it in tighter and reduce that noise. So hopefully with today's video, I gave you a little bit of an idea of what you will encounter when it comes to servicing and maintaining the brake, suspension, and body systems on the Volkswagen Atlas and Volkswagen Atlas Crosssport. We do have a number of other videos available on the channel that go into the engine, transmission, and driveline systems of these vehicles, plus DIYs available for all the parts and pieces that we covered here today. If you have any questions or comments on something I may have missed or you want to expand on, please leave it in the section below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel where we have a lot more videos just like this one. And with that, we'll see you on the next one.